Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. My guest on this episode once said, "In the slippery world of risk, uncertainty, change and complexity, hard and fast rules can be rare and sometimes a trap." So he's a perfect guest for a discussion on human risk. Gerald Ashley specialises in business risk and decision making. His work concentrates on trying to understand decision making, risk taking and human behaviour in the face of uncertainty. Prior to concentrating on decision making analysis, Gerald had a 25-year career in banking in London, Hong Kong and Basel. He is a fantastic character and such a lot of fun to spend time with. As someone who tells great stories, I was absolutely astonished to discover that this is his very first appearance on a podcast. So I'm delighted that he's chosen the Human Risk one to mark that special occasion. So please sit back and enjoy my incredibly thought-provoking conversation with storyteller and all-round raconteur, Gerald Ashley. Gerald, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Christian, great pleasure to be here. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. And look, before we get into a host of different topics, can you just give my listeners a sense of kind of your interest in the sort of topics of risk and behavioural science, where that came from?
Yeah, sure. My background, as people will see, is in finance. And I think we went on an amazing risk journey in finance from the days when I first started in the city in the late 70s. By the mid-80s, when all the markets had opened up and there'd been a lot of deregulation, a lot more risk was being taken or was allowed to be taken. And a lot of different approaches were tried. And the main approach that was tried was mathematical. Was to say, let's look at distribution of outcomes. Various products came to mind. People who are familiar will have heard of things such as RAROC, which was risk-adjusted return on capital, and also risk metrics. And these were a way of trying to put a mathematical framework around risk and to properly price it, or more efficiently price it. But it soon became quite clear. I don't think you had to be a great Nostradamus to see, certainly by the late 80s, that trouble was ahead. We had a hint of it with the crash in 1987, where this was the sort of shock horror sort of headlines of computers had taken over the stock exchange, which seems funny to think that's what more than 30 years ago. But there was a feeling that while maths may offer a lot of the answer, it also may be leading us up the garden path. And it was from that I started looking at behavioural finance, really.
One of the things that you have focused on is this idea of certainty. And I'm fascinated to sort of understand a little bit more around that and the psychology and how that manifests itself in practice.
Yeah, I think that's very much central to who we are as human beings, actually. When I started looking at, let's say, the non-mathematical side of risk, it didn't take very long before an American economist called Frank Knight sort of came out of the woodwork. He was really very distinguished in the 1920s, so some 100 years or so ago, and he coined the phrase Knightian uncertainty. And this was the idea that at some point you don't have enough information to be able really to treat something with a normal risk model. And he had the idea, and if you can visualize this, of a continuum that down one end of it you had absolute certainty. And right at the other end, you had total ignorance. Not that one was stupid, but that there was just no information that you had about something that was going to happen. This is Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. So the first thing to say about certainty is, of course, it's a philosophical construct. Nothing is absolutely certain. Everything's slightly floating and is dynamic. Nothing in the world is fixed, with the possible exception of American professional wrestling, of course. But essentially, there are some things that are very close to being certain, and they're very easy to model, and we like it. We like the certainty that sunrise can be predicted tomorrow at a certain time. We like the certainty of having a job. Maybe we get a lot of spiritual comfort from following a particular creed or religion. And this seems very central to the human condition.
It is fascinating. As you were talking, I was sort of thinking about, there's that old quote about the only things that are certain in life is death and taxes. And yet, there are lots of examples of things where we like, as you say, we like to give certainty. So we have train timetables, which if you live in the UK or certain parts of the UK, you'll know are not necessarily reflective of the reality on the ground. If you live in Japan, slightly different story. But I think there is something interesting, as you say, that we like to have guarantees and certainty. And so much of financial services in some respects is about offering that. So you give people insurance products and you offer them, there are derivatives there that allow people to, for legitimate and perhaps less legitimate reasons, take the edge off and the uncertainty off and provide guarantees.
Yeah, I mean, if you like, we're buying into a framework, and a framework that gives us comfort and a certain amount of ease. It's not my specialization, but certainly at a general level, when you look at evolution and how we as humans have evolved and developed over time, we are still very keen on finding the next food source and nailing it down and being certain to get it. And I think those sort of traits show themselves across a whole range of our behavior. And of course, the commercial world has picked up on this very quickly because certainty sells. The big boss says, look, give me the solution. Give me the answer. Are you certain you've got it right? Well, how do you define what is right? And I think, like a lot of things in life, trouble arises when people oversell certainty. So they make claims that are just cannot be substantiated or are just so wild as to be completely wacko. But there is still a number of people who will follow strange cults and all the rest of it because of this unbelievably strong desire for certainty.
And I'm always struck by this. There's that. I can't remember who came up with this. I was talking about the medical profession. Who would you prefer? The doctor that knows with certainty what's wrong with you, or the one that sort of has to thumb through the book and kind of guess around and give you a sort of, well, it could be this or it could be that. And of course, we want to know what's right or wrong. And I find it fascinating that we all clearly know that life is uncertain, and yet we're susceptible to believing some of these people that are there to give us things. When probably, if we were to use our critical faculties a little bit more, we'd recognise that actually what they're saying can't be true.
Yeah, it's quite a lonely thing to do that if you think about it, because you do actually face a very visceral fear when you look at uncertainty and you look to the future. What we tend to do is try and find maybe partial solutions. So this is why things like scenario planning are quite good, because we kind of run through all the potential ideas. But scenarios would go out the window if we could only find the person who could sell us the solution who would do it. The truth is, much of life is about sort of learning by doing. That, of course, doesn't apply to skydiving, but a lot of what you do is through experience and sort of taking knocks and making mistakes. And of course, that's very important, because if you look at evolutionary theory, we are a product of mistakes. That's what mutations are. There's a copying error, and through a remarkable set of circumstances, evolution has developed both you and I. It's done that without any great deal of thought, of course. It's just done it blindly. And the thing about that is it is about trial and error. And so there's this tension, I think, between us wanting everything to be certain. But if we're going to advance into the future, into that darkness that is tomorrow, you have to have some sort of flexibility and innovation and the ability and willingness to do trial and error.
That's really interesting, because when I look at sort of corporate organizations where in order for companies to survive, you, as you say, if you don't innovate, you are going to become extinct, because particularly now where digital allows a whole host of innovations that might not have been possible in the past. And so you have a lot of companies trying to clamp down on things. We have zero tolerance for this and zero tolerance for that. And it's sort of, and I think there's a fascinating piece around quarterly reporting as an example. Companies constantly having to report back. We constantly have to demonstrate growth, because that's how we justify our existence, and chief executives get paid vast sums of money for demonstrating growth. And yet, as you say, it's the screw ups are going to happen, and there's an inevitability to it. And we seem to be very unaccepting of that. And I think the real manifestation that I see at the moment is politicians who are unwilling to admit they've made mistakes. So there's this narrative of we've got everything right, when clearly, and you and I are both sat in a country where this example is playing itself out beautifully, clearly there have been screw-ups, but people don't want to admit to those because there's something wrong in failing.
And maybe there's a certain amount of fault with the electorate in that we don't like the idea that, we haven't selected the A-star team to run the country. And, the electorate tends to punish politicians who are overly honest sometimes. And maybe that's what we sort of reap as a requirement. The other element to all of this, we talked about certainty a lot. We talk a little bit more about uncertainty. What Frank Knight was trying to say was that some things lend themselves to being modelled, so that you've got a large amount of data. I gave of past data. I gave an example earlier of sunrise or sunset or tide tables or all of this, because we've got a heap of past data and we've observed they're cyclical in nature. It's quite possible to extrapolate forward with almost blinding confidence that we know what the sunset will be in the year 3000 on the 10th of January or whatever. We can't be 100% certain because some event in the meantime may happen. We may have blown ourselves to bits with nuclear power or whatever, or maybe nuclear weapons rather. But what the problem is that in life, not everything is like the tide and sunset. A lot of things we've only got partial information. And there comes a point where things are not at all certain that there's a cycle, and it's not at all certain you've got enough past data to be confidently able to extrapolate forward. That, of course, doesn't stop us, because the old phrase, if you've got a hammer, every problem is a nail. I would say nowadays, if you have a spreadsheet, everything must be something you can stick in a spreadsheet, and if it doesn't count. And that's again coming back to this sort of frameworking idea. So the less information, the less certainty, if you like, you've got about something, the less cyclicality or predictability about it, the more you've got to step into a more, or how shall I put it, a less comfortable area. And a lot of people don't like that.
It's interesting because on the one hand, you're right, we like predictability. On the other hand, there are things that we do to excite us and interest us, which involve a degree of unpredictability. And I'm thinking, for example, of entertainment. So we will go and we'll go to the theatre, or we'll watch a movie, and we sort of have an idea what's going to happen, and we know how long we're committing to it. But part of the reason we watch is to see what happens. So part of the reason you get successful TV shows is that you don't know who done it, being a prime example, right? You're hanging around to find out who, the clue is in the name, who has done it. Or we go and do, skydiving is the example you gave. There's a little bit of risk taking and uncertainty around it. Or we travel to a foreign country, or we try food we've not tried before. So there is a little bit of us that seems to want that sort of energy of uncertainty, albeit that you're absolutely right, is that people's propensity to push that to the limits sits with, there's a small percentage of the population that sort of seem to go for take massive amounts of risk. But the majority of us like it. But there is an element of us that's chasing that adventure and chasing that sense of freedom of not being constrained by predictability.
Yeah, I get that. I think it's also often in an overall safe environment. So take a good example of this might be something like roller coasters. So a roller coaster, you get quite a lot of excitement. Very unfortunately, very rarely there have been roller coaster accidents, but in general, you're getting the thrill within a controlled environment. And I think that's what a lot of people like. And it's why I think it's quite difficult if we switch the focus a little bit to business. For people who say have worked in large, safe organizations, maybe in a very stable type of business that doesn't change, they may either face a form of disruption to that business, or they may become unemployed, and they may find, whether they will like it or not, they have to become freelancers or entrepreneurial. And that is frightening to a large number of people. And we all have responsibilities, family and all the rest of it. So people are probably, we tend to be overcautious. At the individual level, that may lead for a slightly duller life, or a very dull life. At the group level, it probably makes a certain amount of sense, because we buy certainty from one another, in that we buy goods and services and they turn up and are delivered and all the rest of it. So it's quite a sort of complex matrix of things going on there.
And it's interesting as well, you talk about sort of interpersonal relationships. You know, you hang around with people, so you get to know them, you build those trusting relationships, and you can you have an idea about how that person will behave, and therefore there's a predictability around that piece. If there's somebody you don't know, you're a little bit more cautious. And there's a lovely German word that always comes to mind, which is unberechenbar, which literally means incalculable. And it's a sort of insult, which is to sort of go, this person is, you don't know what they're going to do. And I always thought that's it's interesting, because on the one hand, that's what comedy is all about. On the other hand, it's a big insult, because you go, there's a lunatic here who might do something crazy, and I need to step really carefully around it. So I think it's fascinating when one thinks about those interpersonal dynamics. The same thing applies.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's a new German word for me. I don't know that one.
I've been called it a few times. That's why.
That's why you're familiar with it. And maybe another sort of angle to think about here is that we touched upon this idea of modelling things, and you can see why models suddenly appear, because they seem to offer an answer. So, you could take this philosophical idea that, well, we'll get all the data, we'll get truckloads of data, and then we'll get the boffins in who can do the curly brackets and all the rest of it. And not only will they come up with an answer, but they'll come up with an answer to 10 significant figures. So, it must be right. It's not 2/3, it's 65.432, whatever it may be. And therein lies another great danger. And one of the things I think we have to be aware of when we look at models is that the buyers and sellers in models have got different expectations. The sellers, the people who create models, realize that they have made a certain number of approximations and assumptions in their model that may or may not work in all conditions. The classic example of this is Black-Scholes for option pricing that assumes there's a continuously underlying market. Well, anybody who's been in markets knows as soon as there's any trouble, what's the first thing that goes out the window is liquidity, and so that model is in difficulty. So the sellers create this model that is replete with a large number of caveats and issues around it. But the buyer doesn't see that. The buyer, who wants the solution, who wants the answer, says, well, this must be right, because, I only did woodwork at O-level, and this guy's got a PhD in maths, so he must be a genius. And we've got all this data, and they put it through some phenomenally complex algorithm. And look, we've got the answer. And, a single answer to a problem is nearly always wrong. I mean, things are just not that clear cut. In fact, when you stand back and look at almost anything, it's amazing how little anything is clear cut, actually. And so I think this sort of tension in models is the sellers or the makers of models are misunderstanding what the buyers think about that model. The buyers are not worried about all the assumptions. They just want the answer, and they want it now.
There's a little bit, of course, of being slightly cynical around you can make the opposite argument. Say the sellers understand perfectly what the buyer's perspective, and they're pushing something that presses the right buttons. I will, if one looks at the way products are marketed, whether that's a digital product or something intangible like insurance, or whether that's every single thing is sold as being the perfect solution to X. And there's never any sort of admission of kind of, well, this is a bit crappy. It's all, and because I think that plays into that. It's sort of, I want to know that when I'm buying a car, that I've made the best possible choice.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then again, maybe to pull it out to the big picture thought, which is again to sort of slightly lean on evolutionary theory. I think a lot of people, and this certainly was true of myself until I sort of studied it a bit and gave it some thought. People think that progress advances at a sort of steady rate. Everything's kind of a little bit better than last year. And, in some ways that's true. So if you buy a car now and you've had the same crappy old car for 20 years, you're quite astonished at what, the kit and equipment that comes. But it will have crept up on you every year. But it's just that your reference point is from 20 years ago. And that's classic incremental change. And the vast majority of the world, for the vast amount of time, is in some form of incremental change. And then occasionally we get a disruption. Now, this in evolutionary theory is known as punctuated equilibrium. Doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. But what it's saying is that there are periods where things are really quite quiet and gentle. And then if you can visualize a sort of maybe a slightly improving graph ticking up steadily, you suddenly get a big sharp move up, or could even be a sharp move down. Physicists call this phase transition, and it's the idea suddenly that all the rules are out the window because your very nice model in the past has been completely blindsided. And this, without getting on my soapbox too much, is what concerns me about big data. Big data is a phenomenal resource of the past. It tells you everything you possibly want to know for the past. And again, if like tide tables and the sunrise, people are always going to react in exactly the same way, or external elements are always going to be exactly the same, you can crunch that big data and you'll get lots of lovely answers, and you can put normal distribution curves around it and all that sort of stuff, and you'll be fine. But if there is a genuine new disruption, you just well throw it in the bin. And the trouble is, of course, you don't know when that's coming. Because if you did know where it's coming from, you would have diminished the shock effect of that disruption in the first place. So that tension between incremental and disruptive is very important.
That's very timely for the moment, right? Where there's that, I can't remember who said this. You'll probably know the comment around there are some decades that feel like weeks and weeks that feel like decades, or something along those lines. That basically said there's short periods of time where lots happens, and then lots of periods of time where nothing happens, or nothing feels like nothing's happening. And at the moment we're going through what feel like pretty seismic changes in terms of both in terms of diversity and equality, where there's things happening, and then you've got coronavirus running alongside that's doing a whole host of things, both in terms of the disease itself, but the knock-on consequences about the use of technology, the way we're thinking about things, which businesses are going to survive, which aren't, and things we took for granted that are no longer there. So I think it's a really fascinating time to be making that point, because it feels like we're in a very disruptive phase.
Quickly on quotes, I have a rule on quotes. If it's not Einstein, it's always Lenin. So I think it's probably Lenin on this one. And it doesn't matter. You can just say anything and you just put Einstein after it. So you can make a quote that says, don't you think Netflix has been a phenomenally great disruptor in broadcasting? And the quote is from Lenin or Einstein.
Right. Now, I've always found Orwell and Churchill are the two that I seem to come across more often.
Yes. Maybe it's saying something about me that I seem to hang around Lenin a lot. You make a very good point, and I think another way to visualize this may be slightly strange, but when you were a kid in school and you took a ruler and you used to put it on the end of the desk and you used to give it a kind of a little wang, if you like, the wang element is the disruption, and then of course a ruler moves around a lot, but eventually it finds a point of stability. Now, people at the moment think that we're getting a large number of external shocks I would say that's true, but I'm not certain that the shock actually started now. I think we're seeing large volatility and large variability from some events that go back quite a long way. In the technology world, for example, most of the really big technological breakthroughs are in the 50s and 60s. And in fact, it's been the incremental development, the industrialization of the idea, if you like. So somebody like Steve Jobs is a particularly good example of that. They've taken a disruptive set of technologies that have come together and produced some superb incremental technology. Incremental to the fact that we're on iPhone 11 or what the hell it may be.
I've lost count.
But your wider point about maybe on the social and political thing, I think may be true, and I think it may be just because we're all more joined up. Let's be frank. This terrible incident in Minneapolis a couple of weeks ago. How many people in Britain, if you stopped in the street now and you'll say, in fact, Minneapolis is 2 cities across the river, can you name the other one? They can't. Nobody knows about this. So we have a very...
St. Paul, by the way, just to prove I do know something.
Yeah, I knew I was on the right podcast, a very educated...
That's it. That's my knowledge done for the podcast, but thank you for bringing that.
I'm going to say I'm going to struggle about anything else about Minnesota, other than I think it has a lot of early German immigration, which... neither here nor there, but I think quite a lot of German speakers there. But you take my point that in one way we seem a lot closer together because now, and this may be a function of cheap bandwidth. I mean, why do we have so many TV stations? Acres and acres of this stuff on 24/7. There's not enough news for 24/7, but now there's a bandwidth to be able to transmit all this stuff to me. And there's also the wherewithal for a guy with quite a small video camera to be in the middle of nowhere and to report on something that essentially would have in the past gone unreported. So we're in a much more reported world. And I think that brings in many more factors, some of which can be destabilizing. And I think one of the fascinating things in life, and I don't know the answer to this, is what makes one thing become viral rather than another. Some things take off in a big way, and that, in a way, segues into the next little thought, which is about networks. Why is it that certain things come alive and come alike? I mean, I know you've had Rory Sutherland on this show, and he's in the business of trying to make things go viral. You know, how do you get noticed? How do you differentiate? And I'm sure if you asked him, it's very difficult to know why campaign A worked and campaign B didn't. And so back to the certainty thing, we're being rocked a bit, I think, by all this new information in this more connected world than we used to.
Picking up on the viral thing, it's amazing when you start to play in this space because, you know, the things, and I haven't had anything go properly viral, but the things that seem to fly on social media, you know, if I just click a link, put a link to an article that someone else has written, that seems to go nuts. If I make effort to write something myself, you know, I put a lot more, it has much less traction. Now I recognize the biases in that I think my content is clearly more valuable than other people's, and therefore. But it is fascinating. There is no logic to it. But I guess if it was logical and simple to dissect, people would be gaming that, and maybe the more sophisticated people are truly gaming that in a way that we've seen, you know, interference in elections and everything else. But you're right. It's a fascinating piece, and I think what we're seeing at the moment is an inability for us to be able to handle all the data that's hitting us. And so I think we're drawing the wrong conclusion, and I think that's where you get this manipulation piece at the moment. Is we're not designed to take on board all these different pieces of information, and we can't calibrate where it's coming from anymore because I don't know whether is it genuinely someone filming something in the back of Beyond, or is it being faked from St. Petersburg?
Yeah,
and it's fascinating to sort of work that out. And I don't know what the answer is because I don't think we're equipped to deal with it.
No, and you might even take a slightly sort of Stone Age view and say that actually, do we need all this information? But again, something is going on in our heads that we are absolutely gripped with all this stuff. The latest rumor, the latest outrageous tweet, the latest stupid comment by an actor or somebody on the telly or whatever it may be, and then these things seem to take off. But in the sum total of whether it's helping me get through the day on the planet, why am I bothering with this? I have no idea why I'm bothering with it. But I think you're right that the cynical or the calculated view that it's quite easy to manipulate people is very true, potentially very sinister. And this is maybe more your area than mine, is how do we trust something? How do we calibrate that trust? Are we too trusting? And what do you do about that? And I think that's a difficult area.
But I think part of the challenge here is I sort of look at two things. And I say, one is I don't think people are being taught critical thinking. That doesn't seem to factor on and I make that presumption purely because I see large swathes of people not clearly displaying a complete lack of understanding of critical thinking. So either they've got the faculty and they're not deploying it, or they've probably never been taught it. And I think it's very interesting that we maybe we pick it up as we look at things like history. And we're taught to sort of think about, the idea of revisionist history is something people recognize from education. But generally speaking, at school, we get it at kindergarten where we're allowed to do what the hell we want. And then it becomes a bit more ordered and regimented. And I'm not sure syllabuses, or is it syllabi? I always get confused, cover this particular piece. And I think critical thinking is vital at the moment, albeit even if you are capable of displaying critical thinking, it's some of the things you need to think critically about. It would be overloading if we had to challenge every single thing that was presented to us. So we have to, but to your point on trust, we have to, to a certain extent, trust people.
Yeah, and this is why I suppose there are worries about various institutions, whether they be government, whether they be commercial institutions, or just sort of things that are general utilities in life. And I think all of this has been a double-edged sword. We've got, in many ways, the world has become better. All the statistics show pretty on nearly all measures that life as a whole is getting better. But I think at an individual level, a lot of people seem to be racked by anxieties or get wrapped up in quite pointless campaigns on the internet about things, which, good Lord, I mean, I don't actually make a list of them, but if you were to list the really important hashtags from, say, 2014, if hashtags were going then, would we recognize any of them? I don't know. So a lot of this is ephemeral, and it's short term. And of course, we're in the business of being short term. That's what humans are. We like to wang on about long-term plans and long-term lists, but the fact is we're short-term, and we look for short-term solutions, and we look for maybe short-term outrage to get angry with as well.
But it's interesting. I was thinking, as you were saying, I mean, because we can't predict what will, for example, go viral. So what is going to flow through the network? There's an argument that says actually the reason some of these things bubble up to the surface is because it's part of a bigger thing. So you put a hashtag out there, you probably don't know at the time what impact that's going to have. And so there's this piece that says the reason that, it's almost wisdom of the crowds. Everybody throws things out there and we see what we like the look of. And, I think there's some interesting pieces that we see nowadays. And I know you're a big fan of hers, but if you look at Greta Thunberg as an example, there's somebody who just decided to go on a little protest and sit outside I think it was her town hall every Friday and bunk off school. And I think it's really interesting what's happened there, because she didn't set out and say, I'm going to change the world. She just went, I'm going to go and do my thing. And that thing blossomed. Now, there will be lots of examples, and of people who have tried to do similar things that have failed miserably, who are still sitting outside their proverbial town hall, waiting for their Greta moment to appear.
Well, yeah, and there are two things there. She's clearly been a catalyst for what I'm personally not particularly certain. But also, of course, we're applying a good bit of, as you've alluded to, survivorship bias here, because in fact there are 100,000 Gretas out there, if you can imagine such a thing, and only one of them has come to the surface. We just do not remember who got the bronze medal in anything in the 2012 Olympics. Nobody cares. And that is really, really brutal thing to say. because, when somebody wins, they always say, well, I have to thank mum and dad because they got me up at 4 a.m. and I ran round in circles for 16 years and I got faster and faster, and here I am, and I've won an Olympic gold medal. The guy or the girl or whoever came 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th also got up at some God-forsaken hour for more than a decade, and also ran round and round and round in circles or whatever it may be. But we dismiss them or we forget them. And so that's an element of becoming viral. I mean, of course, people employ professionals to try and get them, get noticed. I love all these celebrities who are always in the newspaper whining that why won't newspapers leave them alone, when they were actually employing PR agents to keep them in the newspapers. I mean, as an opposite example of that is John Paul Getty, the oil billionaire, and I don't think he was particularly successful at that. But in the 1960s, he hired a US PR firm to keep him out of newspapers. And if you think about it, that's a hell of a difficult thing to do if you've already become prominent. But, there's a big industry of trying to be noticed. And there you go.
Right. And I'm reminded of the fabulous Barbara Streisand story, which, if listeners don't know, this is amazing, where some photographer had taken a picture of the coastline, which included a picture of her house. She was really irritated that she'd had her privacy invaded, so tries to sue the guy, and in the process of suing, it exposes, so more people looked at the picture as a result of that than would have done anyway. And it's called the Streisand Effect. And I love that example of sort of, totally contrarian outcome to the one you were trying to get to. And actually, if you just shut up, nobody would have noticed.
Yeah, she clearly wasn't a fan of the late Labour politician Dennis Healey, who said, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And she'd obviously just selected an incredibly large shovel to keep at it. One other element in all this viral thing that's kind of floating around in the background is this network business, and whether we should look at the idea of networks are not quite as we imagined them, that they're much more dynamic, they're much more flexible, and quite critically, they're not linear. And I have a small bee in my bonnet about, in fact, I tend to sigh very loudly. You remember the old days when we used to go to conferences and listen to people speaking all in a group? I wonder if that'll
I vaguely recall those, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. In the old days. Well, inevitably, somebody stands up and has a talk about strategy, which is always a warning sign. And then to absolutely ram home the point, they always have slides that involve chessmen. So there's always a chessboard, and then as inevitably the global strategy involves lots of very clever allusions to what's going on with chess. This is nonsense squared, because life is not a chessboard. If you and I are playing chess, we've got a fixed board with fixed squares, with fixed players that can only obey certain rules. And look, I go, and then you go, and then I go and respond, etc., etc. That is so far removed from real life or the commercial world as to be farcical. Because it might be I don't get up very early in the morning and you've made 5 moves before I've got going. I also haven't worked out, in fact, there are no rules about where the chessmen can come. And this is what happens when there's a new market. And then eventually, and you'll know quite a lot about this from your background, that the regulators arrive and say, well, actually, different players must have certain rules about what they can do. And maybe this infinite chessboard, we do need to actually put some kind of rule around it and say, not everybody can start a bank, and certainly not just from the back of a taxi in Cornhill. You've got a certain thresholds and all the rest of it. But I do worry when people look at the world and think of it in terms of games and chessmen or poker or whatever. Nassim Taleb called this the ludic fallacy, and it's a wrong way to think about that darkness that is only just an inch in front of us all the time. It's not a nice chessboard.
And actually, it's not necessarily 2 players. could
Oh
be.
no, absolutely. There was a great cartoon in the Guardian about a year ago about there one mentioned the B word, Brexit negotiations, and it was a three-dimensional chessboard with about 30 players, and and it had the comment underneath saying the current state of play or something like that, and that is much closer to reality, and we kind of know that. You know that if you do something like how you negotiate buying a car or who you marry or whether you're planning a divorce or whatever it may be, any big decision is clearly not a chess game. So what we should be doing is thinking about non-linear networks. If people are interested, they need to start looking up things called complex adaptive systems and complexity in general. There's some very good books. Let's plug a book by somebody. Paul Ormerod has written a very good book called Positive Linking, which looks at the network effects and thinking about complexity in the real world. And I think we need to encourage that sort of thinking rather than Mr. Blah standing up with his slides of chessboards.
That sort of points to innovation and people thinking about things very differently. So even just taking an idea that's deployed over here and putting it in a different context can be a fantastic piece of innovation. But equally, coming up with something mind-blowing and very different that's never been done before, never seemingly done before, that can also be a different form of innovation. I think it's really interesting when we look at sort of how we permit that back to the sort of trial and error piece, because there are clearly some contexts in which we don't want people to go crazy and do what the hell they want, because that has consequences. So I always think of the nuclear power industry, a good example where we don't want people who are thinking innovatively about how they manage the reactor. Doesn't tend to end particularly well. And yet there's other spheres where we really do want experimentation, openness. And I think there's back to your point around certainty. On the one hand, there are aspects of our existence where we do need that certainty. Going on the road, let's not have people thinking innovatively about how they interpret the traffic regulations. But equally, there's other contexts where you do want it. And I think there's a fascinating tension here, is that to progress, we need to allow some of these sort of boundary stretching new ways of thinking. On the other hand, we need the stability to be able to kind of continue our existence and work collectively.
Yeah, and I think that's what politics is all about. How much should be top down and how much should be bottom up. Also, people's mindsets. A good way to think about this is when, I suppose everybody is at home at the moment. I was going to say when they go home.
Well, everybody on this listening to this podcast are, because they're responsible listeners, Gerald.
Yes, of course. And say you're going to cook a meal this evening. There are two approaches. One of which is you download a Delia Smith recipe, and you've been carefully boning up on all the ingredients you've got to need and find, and you follow Delia to the letter, and you create this meal, and of course it's never quite as good as what you're hoping. That's one approach. The other approach, which I tend to favour, is open the fridge and see what's inside and have a go at something. As a result, I've had some quite unusual meals. Totally unrepeatable, of course, because there's no way I'm going to be able to replicate the exact.
And I don't want to go back to hospital again.
Exactly. Thank you for that. But again, if you think in a way, that's what the entrepreneur does. The entrepreneur opens the fridge and says, well, in the past, we've always used rice with a curry. Why don't we use spaghetti? And then they say, well, actually, that's a really particularly bad idea, or actually it works quite well. So I think experimentation is important. And that may be one last bugbear to talk about, which is that we, and it comes back to this idea you had right at the start about politicians not admitting to failure. We must actually admit to failure, and we should potentially even reward failure to an extent, to encourage people to keep failing until something works. Now, most industries and most corporations hate this idea. They would like a nice stable market with nice stable regulation, incremental changes. The volume goes up to 11 on this amp, not stops at 10. But they don't want anything that's difficult or different. Whereas if you go back through history again, and people might want to look up the history of skunk works. The skunk works was an idea to actually develop a big ideas department outside the mainstream of the business, and that you hired some of the best brains you could afford to take out of the mainstream business to go off and think things. And a lot of people, when they were selected on those things, are very nervous because they say, look, I've got a very good career, I'm doing very well, I'm a global head of widgets or whatever it may be, and you're going to call me off to do the blue sky thinking and all the rest of it. But what companies who started on this and has been shown to be a valuable way to do it is that you promote some of those people after they've been through the skunk works, even if they only come up with a square wheel. So you actually incentivize. I mean, the complete idiots, of course, you don't. You put them back. But there will be some people, they don't need to have succeeded with a new product, but they need to have gone through the process of thinking in a different way. And I think that should be encouraged. But of course, it comes from a cost, because shareholders turn around and say, well, hang on a moment. So, 5 or 10% of the firm's resources are being developed in some department which may or may not produce anything ever. And it's the commercial equivalent of academic original research. And firms are loath to do it. But if you do look at some of the very best firms, that's what they do. And I think it's worth pursuing.
Yeah, and I was, as you were talking, actually, there was a very interesting thing at a certain Swiss bank that I'm relatively familiar with, where they came out and had a little group of people who were sort of there, and it was a sort of think tank type exercise, but you knew that it was cleverly done because they cited them somewhere very cool in a sort of startup land. They were allowed to use Macs, which tells you quite a lot about how radical they were allowed to be, completely off the grid. And they were doing some interesting things around, for example, if you're a bank, let's think about what wealth means. And what about if we could, using virtual reality, create a world where you have the feeling of being wealthy? You don't actually need to be wealthy, and thinking around these topics. And I remember coming across and thinking, this is what a waste of time, right? It looked awesome, right? What a great way to spend your day, very self-indulgent. But it was fascinating, and it wasn't necessarily that any of the things they came up with were themselves actionable. But it was just what comes off the back of that, and the sort of the riffing of almost like it's like musicians sitting there in a studio. Often it'll produce absolute garbage that will never hit anybody else's ears. But occasionally you get genius jamming sessions that produce incredible bits of music. I always think of things like Bohemian Rhapsody and kind of go, that's a bit, doesn't tick any of the traditional boxes, and yet seems to be a massive hit for reasons that elude me.
It didn't fit into a genre, and if you'd asked the recording company to form a committee on what the next song should look like, it wouldn't look like that. And that opens up a whole other area of things. Is it useful? Is it useful looking at focus groups and consumers' opinions about things, because they often are very anchored in the past, and you will know this quote, but Henry Ford, who said that if I'd asked my clients or customers what they want, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. And so it can be quite difficult to break out of wherever you are to think about new things. And of course, it means you just have to get used to failure, because you're going to fail a lot. And people don't like that.
Right, and there's something interesting I was reading about Amazon, actually. And if you look at what Bezos has done there, he creates his bookstore and then moves into a whole load of crazy things that so he moves into, we'll sell anything. So he then becomes a logistics business, and then he gets Amazon Web Services, and now he's moved into medical testing. And I sort of look at that and go, he is hugely unencumbered because he's able to think freely. But somebody pointed out that, interestingly, his divorce might stop that, because he's had to give 50% of his holdings to his wife, and therefore actually she is potentially not motivated to be collaborative and can block him. So he doesn't have that. The reason he can do that is he controls the company.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they pay dividends at Amazon, do they? They don't pay, the shareholders don't get dividend income. You could imagine she might put her hand up to say, well, why don't we just stay as we are and take a dividend?
Right.
In fact, that would be a lovely little public signal in a way to see what's going on. So maybe just to pull a few of these threads together, I think a lot of this comes down to being open to new ideas, to realizing that nobody actually knows what's definitely going to happen next. There is nothing definite. Some individuals, some organizations, governments, companies have natural areas which they can, to use Warren Buffett's phrase, have got a natural moat around that they can protect their area. But even the greatest names collapse and fail in time. Empires come and go, big businesses come and go. So it's about trying to encourage people to think flexibly and not to be hung up by any particular mantra. And I think it's quite difficult to do that, to always be open to things, because again, that doesn't play well with the sort of short-term answer, solution, I want it on my desk by Monday sort of mantra that is very prevalent in everything. And I thought, I don't know if you want to hit the stop recording button at some stage, Christian, because we've wittered on a bit. We've wittered on a bit, but before I get cut off by the studio director, we can't go without mentioning one of the important people in all of this, which is, of course, the guitarist Keith Richard. And Keith Richard has the most wonderful quote, which has absolutely nothing to do with what we've been talking about for the last 45 plus minutes, but actually really kind of is important. He was talking about music, and he said, I can't do the impersonation, but you've got to get the sort of language drawl to really appreciate it, which is, he says, look, the trouble these days is that everybody talks about rock. They never talk about the roll. And I can just visualize Keith sort of drawling that phrase out. But it struck me straight away, because if we substitute rock for certainty and the roll for uncertainty and questioning things, I think that's very true. We talked a lot this morning about the buying and selling between ourselves of certainty, and everything a lot of life concentrates on certainty, whereas in fact the real challenge is the uncertainty, is the roll. It is the fact that things are dynamic, things are slippery, things go wrong. As a result, all plans sort of go out the window, and having that flexible approach and concentrating on the role is important. So bear that in mind the next time the Stones are on your, I don't even know what kit and equipment people use anymore. I mean, I'm still
Spotify. Let's just leave it there.
Spotify. Let's give them an ad. There we go. But yeah, so Rolling Stones, just think about certainty and uncertainty, basically.
I think that is a fantastic note on which to finish. Wow, so much stuff we've covered. I knew it was going to be wide-ranging and fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I know my listeners will have done too. I will put links in the show notes to things you've done in the past, and also to your website, because I know that people will want to engage further on these things. And he does a mean turn as a speaker, so if anybody's interested in that or just hearing more from Gerald, I will make sure you can connect with him that way. But listen, thank you so much, one, for always being great company, and I look forward to having more physical meetings in future. There's a lunch that has to be done at some stage, but in the meantime, getting you on the podcast is a good substitute for that in a virtual world. So thank you so much for your thoughts and for appearing on the podcast.
Christian, thank you very much. Been a great pleasure. Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Gerald for some really thought-provoking conversations, and of course to you for listening. If you're new to the podcast, then you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. If you had a chance to leave a review at the same time, that's hugely appreciated. It allows other people to find the show and for me to continue to invite high-quality guests onto it. If you're interested in learning more about Gerald's ideas, links to his books and speeches that he has done, you'll find links to all of that in the show notes. Only thing left for me to say is thank you again for listening, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon on another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.